We're into session 19 of the book of Daniel. Hopefully we'll get through chapter 11, verses 5 to 20 this morning. Now, while the kingdom of Alexander was divided up into 4 sections, Daniel will be concerned with only 2 of these. We're going to be concerned with Egypt and Syria. Why? Because the other 2 previous have got no relationship to Israel during this period. Since Daniel is writing his prophecy from the point of view of how it will affect the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, he ignores Thrace and he ignores Macedonia and Greece. He's only interested in Egypt and Syria. In any case, he's only given revelation concerning Egypt and Syria anyway. Now, throughout this section, there'll be references to the king of the north. King of the north is always Egypt. King of the south is always, king of the north is always Syria. King of the south is always Egypt. So we look at the succession of kings in both these countries. Because Daniel will have cause to refer to them in the text as we go through it. In Egypt, there was just the Ptolemaic dynasty, and every king's name begins with Ptolemy. This is a title, it's a bit like Pharaoh. So instead of calling him Pharaoh, I'm going to call him Ptolemy. It's the kings of the kings of the south. First was Ptolemy I Soter. As you see there on the screen, he ruled from 323 till about 284. He'll be referred to in chapter 11, verse 5. Second, we have Ptolemy II Philadelphus, from 285 to 284 until about 246. We see him in verse 6. Then Ptolemy III, from 246 to 221. We're going to see in verses 7 to 9. And then we move on to the kings of the, continuing with the kings of the south, we have Ptolemy IV, Philopator from 221 to 204. We're going to see him in verse 10 and 10 to 12. And then we have Ptolemy V, Epiphanes from 204 until 180. We're going to see him in verses 14 to 17 of chapter 11. And then the last one, the last Egyptian king we'll be concerned with is Ptolemy Philopator, Ptolemy VI Philopator from 180 to about 145. Okay, now we're going to look at the kings of the north. North is Syria. So the dynasty here is headed up by the Seleucids in Daniel 11. These are the kings of the north. They either have the title of Seleucus or Antiochus. That's their title. There's Seleucus I Nicator, 312 to 280. We're going to see him in verse 5. Antiochus I Soter, also known as Sidetes, from 280 to 261. We don't see him in Daniel at all. And then Antiochus II Theos, we're going to see him 260 to about 246. We're going to see him in verse 6. And we have Seleucus II Callinicus from 246 to 245. We're going to see him in verses 7 to 9. And then 5th, Seleucus III, he's mentioned in verse 10. 6th one we have is Antiochus III the Great. We see him from 223 until about 186. We're going to see him in verses 10 to 19. And then we have the 7th one, who is Seleucus IV Philopator. We see him in verse 20. Then Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, 175 until 164. Daniel's going to spend most of his time on this Syrian king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. We're going to see him in chapter 11, verse 21 to 35. We're going to spend a lot of time with him. Okay, so, and then the 9th, we have Antiochus V Eupator, and then 10th, Demetrius I Soter, and 11th, Alexander Balas, 150 to 145. The last 3 are not referred to by Daniel at all. It is this part of Daniel's book that is so detailed and so literally fulfilled that gave critics all the trouble, because it's just so detailed. That's why they insist that Daniel was written much later than it claims, and it's therefore Daniel is a fake. Okay, now on to the scriptures. The conflict between the Egyptian Ptolemies and the Seleucids of Syria. We're going to see this in verses 5 to 20. So here we're going to see the conflict between these two. And verse 5, and the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. The king of the south throughout this passage is always, as I said before, a reference to Egypt, and here it is a reference to Ptolemy I Soter. He was the son of Ptolemy Lagus, one of Alexander's Macedonian generals who survived the skirmish after the battle after the death of Alexander. And that was when both sons of Alexander were killed. And then he took on the title of king in the year 309 BC. The text goes on to say that one of his princes shall be strong above him. And now this prince is Seleucus I Nicator. He was appointed originally as a satrap or a leader over Babylon in 321 BC. Set a big sign saying slow down. When the empire was divided. But then we had Antigonus, another of Alexander's generals, invaded his territory, and Seleucus had to flee for refuge down in Egypt. Now, while he was there, he was made a general for Ptolemy I Soter, and so he became his prince by this means. So this is the prince we're talking about here. Now, with the forces of Ptolemy and Seleucus coming together, they were able to defeat Antigonus in 312 BC. Now, Seleucus I can return to Syria because he's defeated Antigonus. And in 304, he takes the title of king as well back in Syria. And we also see here that, it says he shall have dominion. The he and him refer to Seleucus I Nicator. Eventually, this Seleucus became considerably stronger than his mentor, Ptolemy I. And remember, Ptolemy is in Egypt. He's now up here in Syria. And Daniel says that he shall have dominion. And this is as he takes his position as the rightful king of Syria. Daniel also says that his dominion shall be a great dominion. It actually extended from Phrygia in Asia Minor, that's in modern day Turkey, in the west in modern day Turkey, to India in the east. So he had a pretty large empire there, and it included Syria, Babylonia, and Media. So he became considerably greater than Ptolemy down there in Egypt. Now we look at Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, and Antiochus II, Theos, verse 6. At the end of the years, they shall join themselves together, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm. But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in those times. Now, this is all about the intrigues we're going to see here with the going-ons in the royalty. So this verse begins with the phrase, and at the end of years. That means after a lapse of years. Now, between verses 5 and 6, a total of about 50 to 60 years have elapsed, and during which time there was a continual struggle between the two kingdoms. But eventually they shall join themselves together. And the actions described here occurred in the year 252 BC. Now, the angel explained here to Daniel that the daughter of the king of the south, the Egyptian king, shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. Now, historically, the king of the south at the time was Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and he ascended the throne of Egypt in 284 BC. The daughter of the king of the south shall now come to the king of the north to make an agreement. So the king, as I said, now, Philadelphus at this point in time, he was stronger than the Syrian king. Now, his daughter's name was Berenice. The king of the north was Antiochus II, Theos. He was the son of Antiochus I, Soter. Now, Antiochus II, Theos, was already married, but he was forced by Ptolemy II Philadelphus from Egypt to divorce his wife. And his first wife was a lady or a woman by the name of Laodicea or Laodice, and he was to marry Berenice. Now, Laodice had already borne two sons to Antiochus II, and their names were Seleucus and Antiochus. But with this new marriage, they were now disinherited when their mother's divorce occurred. And the agreement made between these two kings, the king of the south and the king of the north, was that the first son of Berenice would be appointed successor to the Syrian throne. Now, all of this, Daniel says, was in order to make an agreement. Now, because Antiochus II Theos and Ptolemy II Philadelphus had fought each other bitterly right down until the year 252 BC. So this was a purely political marriage, not only as a means of quitting the fighting, but more as a ruse. It's a bit of a deception by which Ptolemy II Philadelphus of Egypt could maintain control over the northern kingdom of the Syrian throne. After all, eventually, if this goes ahead and works out as it should, it would be his own grandson who would then be destined to sit on the throne in Syria. So that's why this is all going on here. But then the angel goes on to tell Daniel, but she shall not retain the strength of her arm. The expression the strength of her arm here means the capacity to do what one wishes, and it's used in both the physical and political realm. In this instance, it has to do with political power, because after their marriage had taken place, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, he dies within 3 or 4 years, and he dies in 246. Now, after his death, Antiochus II Theos quickly divorced his daughter Berenice in favor of his original wife Laodice. So there's a bit of backwards and forwards in here. So the political purpose of this marriage failed completely, because the king in the south is now dead. His daughter is on her own up there in the north, and the king in the north says, I don't need to keep married to you anymore. So he chuffs her off, and then he remarries his first wife Laodice. So the political purpose of this marriage failed completely, and the strength of her arm, this Berenice's arm, was not retained. She couldn't control the king in the north. Neither shall he stand, that is, neither shall Antiochus II Theos retain the initiative. This incident will now bring about his demise as well. Nor his arm, and that's his political power, was also about to fail, because after he had divorced Berenice and had taken Laodice back as his wife, at this point, Laodice became rather vengeful. And after her marriage, now that she was queen once again, ensuring that her 2 sons, remember she had 2 sons by Antiochus here, so that her 2 sons were now going to be the heir apparent to the throne. She totally distrusts her husband's fickleness, if you like, and has him poisoned, as you do with your husband, apparently. Then she proclaimed her son Seleucus II Callinicus king of Syria. So King Antiochus II Theos also failed completely in his political scheming. And then Daniel goes on to say, but she shall be given up. This refers to Berenice here. After the death of her father Ptolemy II Philadelphus and her divorce from Antiochus II Theos, her infant son was also disinherited. So after Laodice had poisoned their shared husband, being still very vengeful, she decided, or she arranged, for Berenice and her son to be also murdered, and that was, I believe, by poisoning as well. So not only Berenice, but they that brought her, that is her royal attendants who came with her from Egypt, they were also to be murdered by Laodice. And he that begat her, this was Ptolemy II Philadelphus from Egypt, he died within a few short years of the political marriage, so his conspiracy also failed. Now, because he was willing to trade his daughter in this way, she and her son were murdered, and he that strengthened her in those times. Now, that refers to her husband, Antiochus II, who had been her strength. But now that he had divorced her, she had no power at all left, and also he dies as well. In summary, a bit of a recap. In summary, Antiochus II, Northern, had obtained Berenice's hand in marriage for political reasons. Berenice, the daughter of the king of the south, Egypt. But the agreement between the kings was unsuccessful. Laodicea's war of vengeance did not end with the assassination of the rival wife, her son, the husband, and their entourage. Numerous assassinations now followed. Now we come to two others, which is Ptolemy III Euergetes and Seleucus II Callinicus. This is verses 7 to 9. But out of a shoot from her roots shall one stand up in his place, who shall come unto the army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. And also their gods with their molten images, and with their goodly vessels of silver and gold shall he carry captive into Egypt. And he shall refrain some years from the king of the north. And he shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but he shall return into his own land. Now, here we have this section, as I said, concerns Ptolemy the third Euergetes of Egypt, and Seleucus the second Callinicus of Syria. So here we have a war of revenge in verse 7. This is a follow-on from verse 6, where Laodice has poisoned Berenice. Now, Laodice's war of revenge would continue into the next generation of kings. Verse 7 says, but out of a shoot from her roots shall one stand up in his place. The shoot from her roots is Ptolemy the third Euergetes. This is Egypt, the brother of Berenice of Egypt. And of course, both have the same father. Their father's dead. It says he stands up in place of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who had died. He shall come onto the army means he's going to take over the military leadership down in Egypt. And he's going to enter into the fortress of Seleucus II Callinicus, the king of the north. So he's going to come from down south to come after the king of the north, who had taken the throne of Syria after his mother Laodice had murdered his father. Now, Syria is now invaded by Ptolemy III Euergetes of Egypt in order to try and save his sister Berenice. She had fled to a place called Daphne, and she sought asylum there in the temple of Apollo. However, the sanctity of the place was of no protection from the wrath of her rival, and Berenice was killed. So Ptolemy arrived too late, for she had already been murdered by Laodice. And when Ptolemy III, the brother, heard of her death, his plans changed from now saving his sister to now avenging her. So Daniel says, he shall deal against them. So in vengeance, he now overthrew all the Syrian fortresses from Cilicia all the way to the Tigris River. He also captured Laodice, who had murdered his sister, and had her executed. And after that, he shall prevail. So Ptolemy III Euergetes went all over Syrian territory at will, destroying one Syrian stronghold after another. And before he left, he erected a bit of a monument in Syria to remind the citizens of his victory. In verse 8 tells us the kind of spoils of war he was able to plunder and take back to Egypt. It says he carried their gods away captive. This shows the humiliation that Syria now suffers. To have your gods taken captive was a sign in those days of extreme humiliation. And it says, and he took away and their molten images. Now, we know from historical records of the period that Ptolemy III Euergetes captured a total of 2,500 images, including the Egyptian images, which had originally been carried away from Egypt into Persia by Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. So all their goodly vessels of silver and gold were carried off as spoil back from Syria down into Egypt. Now, we know he took a total of 40,000 talents of silver from Syria and an unknown number of talents of gold. All this he shall carry captive into Egypt. So when he brought all this captured wealth back into Egypt, the Egyptian people made him called him now Euergetes, which is a Greek name meaning benefactor, because he brought all these goodies back into Egypt. Then verse 8 also says, he shall refrain some years from the king of the north. So Ptolemy II Euergetes did not attack Seleucus II Callinicus ever again. There's an end there. But in verse 9, it's now the Syrian king who seeks reciprocal vengeance. So he shall come into the realm of the king of the south. Seleucus II Callinicus now attacked Egypt around 240 BC in order to try and retrieve all that had been lost and exact some vengeful satisfaction for Ptolemy III's military invasion of Syria. However, just as the angel had revealed to Daniel, Seleucus II was defeated and he shall return into his own land. He had to return to Cydia empty-handed. Now we see Ptolemy IV and Seleucus III and Antiochus III in verses 10 to 11. And his sons shall war and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall come on and overflow and pass through. And they shall return and war even to his fortresses. The king of the south shall be moved with anger and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, and the multitude shall be given into his hand. And the multitude shall be lifted up, and his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. Okay. So here, the prophecies of verses 10 to 12 pertain to the reigns of one Ptolemaic king and two Seleucid kings. So that's one Egyptian king, two Syrian kings. And the two Seleucid kings from Syria were so we have here and Ptolemy IV Philopator and Seleucus III Cyrannus and Antiochus III the Great. These are the three we're going to be dealing with. So here, the prophecy regarding their reigns begins in verse 10 with the transition of power from Seleucus III to Antiochus III. And his sons shall war. That is, the sons of Seleucus II Callinicus, the Syrian king, shall now go to war. Okay, now the angel here, yes, the angel revealed that the sons of Seleucus II would engage in war, and this was Cyrannus and Antiochus III. Without success, Seleucus III continues his father's war in Asia, but he got beaten. His official name was Soter, which means savior, and his nickname was Cyrannus, which means thunderbolt. But he was assassinated in Anatolia by members of his army after a brief reign of less than 2 years. And now his brother, Antiochus III, became king at the age of 18. This is in Syria. Daniel says, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. So the angel now revealed that the brothers would assemble a multitude of great forces. This prophecy was fulfilled more by Antiochus III than by Seleucus III, because Seleucus III had a very short reign anyway. His reign was really too short to add to his father's military forces. Antiochus, on the other hand, gathered a huge army to try and attack Egypt. The next part of the prophecy now was translated incorrectly in the ASV, which is the passage, the Bible we're using here. It says, which shall come on and overflow and pass through, and they shall return and war. The way this phrase is worded makes it sound as if the great forces would come on, overflow, pass through, and so forth. You've probably got in your Bible one, and one shall come and overflow. All 5 verbs in this passage here are in the third person masculine singular, so it would have been better to translate the phrase as one will come, and historically this was Antiochus III. He shall come and overflow and pass through. So he undertook several campaigns against Ptolemy IV Philopator in Egypt, and eventually he did restore Syrian authority as far south as what is known today as the city of Gaza. He made two campaigns following that success, because we see in 219 BC he was stalemated in his first attempt, but then it says he shall return and war even to his fortress. So he came back again. This is a second campaign 2 years later in 217 BC, and this was fought out at the Battle of Raphia, south of Gaza. It was right on the very edge of the Sinai Peninsula. Raphia today is the border city between Israel and Sinai. So after taking Phoenicia and Palestine away from Egypt and coming as far south as Gaza, which marked the border with Egypt, at this point where he actually crosses the border and he now enters into Egypt as far as Raphia. Now, it says the king of the south is now moved with anger because he's trespassing. This is Ptolemy IV Philopator. He was king of Egypt at this time. Now, historical records show us that Philopator IV was a lazy and indolent man who was generally given to easy living and pleasure. Generally, he did not care very much about losing all that territory in the northeast to the Syrians. However, when Antiochus III went past Gaza and then got as far as Raphia on Egyptian territory, he was now moved with anger and he came to fight with Antiochus III. He shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. So Ptolemy IV was married to his own sister, Arsinoe III. Now, in 217 BC, Arsinoe, his sister, accompanied her brother husband to Raphia, where she allegedly inspired the Egyptian troops prior to their victory over the Seleucid army. They come together in front of the Egyptian army to seek revenge for the wars that had happened 2 years earlier in 219 BC. It says, he shall set forth a great multitude. Now, Ptolemy of Egypt brought 70,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 73 battle elephants. But the multitude shall be given into his hand. Now, this multitude refers to the Syrian army of Antiochus III the Great. He had also come up with a large army of 62,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, 102 battle elephants. Battle elephants are a bit like tanks, I guess. He had less infantry than the Egyptians, but he had an overpowering number of elephants, battle tanks, and that was the array of forces drawn up in battle. But Antiochus III the Great, lost, and his army was given into the hand of Ptolemy IV Philopator of Egypt. So the victory at Raphia secured the northern borders of the Ptolemaic kingdom for the remainder of Ptolemy's reign. That's the Egyptian kingdom. So the Egyptians' northern border was now secure once again. It says the multitude shall be given up, means that his superior Syrian forces were carried away in defeat, and his heart shall be exalted. So pronoun his here refers to Ptolemy IV Philopator. And because of his victory, he's lifted up with his pride. The prophecy regarding Ptolemy IV and Antiochus III now ends in verse 12 with the following statement. And the multitude shall be lifted up, and his heart shall be exalted. Historically, Antiochus's multitude, meaning his army, was lifted up in defeat. Now, at this point, Ptolemy IV's heart became exalted. His victory made him proud. And he shall cast down tens of thousands. Daniel goes on to predict here that he shall cast down tens of thousands. Ptolemy IV killed tens of thousands of soldiers, and 5 elephants lost their lives, and he took 40,000 soldiers as prisoners of war. So Syria was left with only a token army. In fact, Antiochus III the Great barely managed to escape capture as he fled in defeat. He only had about 20,000 infantry left. Now, Daniel goes on to say that in spite of his success, he shall not prevail. meaning this is Ptolemy. Ptolemy the Fourth was just simply too lazy and indolent to pursue and press his advantage by going up into Syria to wipe out any effective military retaliation. Consequently, the peace with Syria was only temporary. He was much more interested in getting back to his life of pleasure, and by so doing, he actually angered his own Egyptian people, and this then led to the mysterious death of himself and his sister wife. They both died at the same time, clearly pointing to their assassination. And after Ptolemy IV's death in 204 BC, Ptolemy V Epiphanes ascended the throne in Egypt. Now, his reign lasted about 23 years until 180 BC. For the larger part of this period, his nemesis in the neighboring Seleucid kingdom was Antiochus III the Great. Only when Antiochus III died in 186 did Ptolemy V have to deal with Seleucus IV Philopator. Now, verses 13 to 19, we come to Antiochus III the Great again, but this time it's in connection with the Egyptian king Ptolemy V Epiphanes. Passage begins in verse 13 with a prophecy regarding the fifth Syrian war. And the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former. And he shall come on at the end of the times, even of years, with a great army and with much substance. This is the campaign of Antiochus III against Egypt. The king of the north shall return. Antiochus the Great now returns from Syria to come against Egypt. Now, between the years 212 and 204 BC, he campaigned as far east as India and as far north as the Caspian Sea, and he was gathering strength all the time. Then in 202 BC, he began a series of attacks against Egypt. He shall set forth a multitude greater than the former. So as big as his army was in the second campaign against Egypt, this third one, will be much larger. According to the prophecy, Antiochus would come on at the end of times, even of years. Now, here's a good example that the expression times means years. Remember back in Daniel 9, it talks about times. It was actually around 15 years between his second and third Egyptian campaigns. So he comes back with a great army which has already been battle tested in the east and the north. He comes with much substance, so he had acquired a great amount of wealth and military equipment during those previous eastern and northern campaigns. And verse 14 prophetically describes the conspiracies that would be started against Ptolemy. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the children of the violent among your people shall lift themselves up to establish this vision, but they shall fall. So there were conspirators in the south, Egypt, working against Ptolemy V Epiphanes. He was only a child. He was 4 years old when he ascended the throne of Egypt as a new Ptolemy in 204 BC. Upon his father's death, a bloody conflict ensued over the regency. A Ptolemaic minister by the name of Agathocles appears to have served as like a bit of a regent guardian for some time before being executed by a violent Alexandrian mob. The regency was transferred, because he was only 4 years old, the regency was transferred from one advisor to another, and the state of the kingdom was close to anarchy. And taking advantage of this, Antiochus III now launched an invasion of Egypt. There shall be many that shall stand up against the king of the south. Now, at this point in time, Philip V of Macedon, one of the 4 divisions of Alexander the Great's empire, now agreed with Antiochus the Great to join the conflict and conquer the Ptolemaic territories in Asia Minor and then divide the Egyptian spoil. Also here, Daniel notes, the children of the violent among your people shall lift themselves up to establish division. Now, your people were Daniel's people, since the angel was still speaking to the Jewish prophet. Historically, there was a certain group of Jews that chose to support Antiochus III against the Egyptians. Antiochus III was helped by Jews who led a separate rebellion under a man named Tobias. He attacked the Egyptian garrison in Jerusalem and he took it over. The purpose of this Jewish revolt was to establish the vision, which was the freeing of Israel from foreign dominion. But angel goes on to tell Daniel, but they shall fall, because while they freed Jerusalem from the Egyptians, it simply fell straight under the domination of the Syrians. So freedom from the Ptolemies only meant subjugation to the Seleucids, and Israel did not even become independent. Now, just as an aside, in Rabbinic Judaism, the phrase, the children of the violent among your people, is interpreted as a reference to Jesus and his followers. The Ramban quote, he says, Yeshua, he doesn't call him Yeshua, Yeshua of Nazareth, who aspired to be the Mashiach and was executed by the court, was also alluded to in Daniel's prophecies, 11:14, it states, the vulgar among your people shall exalt themselves in an attempt to fulfill the vision, but they shall stumble. And he says, can there be a greater stumbling block than Christianity? So that was the rabbinic opinion, the rabbinic Judaism opinion of this chapter 11, verse 14 verse. In verse 15, the king of the north, back to Antiochus III, he does succeed this time in defeating Egypt, because in the year 200 BC, his onslaught against the Egyptians was successful, and he dealt a crushing blow to the Ptolemies at the Battle of Panium or Panias near the head of the Jordan River. By 199 BC, the land of Israel was no longer under the control of Egypt, but under the full control of the Syrians. Also, he shall cast up a mound and take a well-fortified city. To cast up a mound means to besiege a city, and the city referred to here was Sidon in what was then Phoenicia, modern-day Lebanon. The background to all this started in 198 BC, and this was a year after Antiochus III took over Palestine from the Egyptians. The Syrians were driven back by a Greek general named Scopas. Now, Ptolemy V was still too young to head up an army, and so he hired this Greek to lead the Egyptian army, and the Syrians were driven back out of Palestine. But then Scopas moved against Syria, and he was defeated by Antiochus III in 198 BC at a place called Panias. This later became known as Caesarea Philippi, which is Banias today. Scopas had to flee, and he retreated to the city of Sidon, which was then besieged by Antiochus III until Scopas surrendered. So as Daniel said, the forces of the south shall not stand. They failed to win the battle of Panias and also failed to withstand the siege of Sidon. It says, neither his chosen people, now pronoun his, it says his chosen people, neither his chosen people. His refers here to Ptolemy V Epiphanes. And when Scopas was besieged in Sidon, the Egyptians sent chosen people and three of their generals, Europus, Menacles, and Damayanus, to try and rescue him, but they failed. However, now Egypt lost any strength to stand and was now defeated. I come now into verse 16. But he that comes against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, and in his hand shall be destruction. Okay. The he that comes against him, that is, he here refers to Antiochus III, while him refers to Ptolemy V. Antiochus III indeed shall do according to his own will. Antiochus III was able to impose his will upon Egypt because the Egyptians were utterly defeated. Daniel prophesied that none shall stand before him, meaning the Syrian will not be opposed. He shall stand in the glorious land. Well, this is a reference to Israel, as we noted earlier. Antiochus III's victory over Scopas at Paneas and Sidon gave him control over Palestine as far south as Gaza. Up to this point, it had been under the dominion of the Egyptians, but now that dominion is transferred securely into Syrian hands, and thus it will remain more or less for the rest of the dominant Hellenistic period. In his hand shall be destruction. Well, this would be better translated as completion, because that is what the Hebrew word means. Antiochus III did not come into Palestine to destroy it as such. The emphasis here is just to show that the whole of the land is completely under his authority. This was certainly demonstrated by his ability to either tax the land of Palestine or not. For the first 3 years after he had taken over the land, he imposed no taxation whatsoever. And then he exempted also the elders, priests, scribes, and the temple singers, and reduced everyone else's tax burden by a third of what it had been after the first 3 years. And he also sent a large sum of money to the Jewish temple as a gift. In verse 17, he now makes an attempt to control Egypt through marriage. As Ptolemy Philadelphus had tried towards Syria with such tragic results, it says, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and with him equitable conditions. Historically, Antiochus III's expansionism led to a conflict with Rome. In 198 BC, Antiochus conquered portions of the kingdom of Pergamum, and the following year he invaded Greek cities in Asia Minor, that's Turkey. In 196 BC, he crossed the Hellespont into Thrace and asserted his authority over territory conquered by Seleucus I in 281 BC. Now, multiple times, so he's pushing his way into Europe. So multiple times, the Romans dispatched ambassadors and demanded that Antiochus stay out of Europe and liberate all autonomous communities in Asia Minor. Well, Antiochus refused. Now, at this point, Antiochus III the Great was being threatened by Rome. So, needing to make some degree of peace with Egypt to counteract that threat, he attempted a diplomatic settlement. He came with full power back to Egypt and started to negotiate from his position of great strength. And he shall perform them, which means he did carry out his side of what he negotiated. So he's going to carry out his side of the bargain. This agreement that he made promised that Ptolemy V could marry Antiochus's daughter of women, Cleopatra I. He shall give him the daughter of women. Antiochus III the Great gave his daughter Cleopatra I to be the wife of Ptolemy V Epiphanes in 193 BC. Now, she's not the famous Cleopatra who got involved with Mark Antony, a different Cleopatra. However, remember, Ptolemy V Epiphanes was only a child. The Egyptian king was only about 7 years old at this time. So the purpose of the marriage was purely strategic. Just as the angel had foretold, it was meant to corrupt her. Corrupt who? Corrupt Egypt. Antiochus was trying to ruin the Ptolemaic kingdom. And through the marriage between Ptolemy and Cleopatra, he had hoped to control the throne of Egypt. He assumed that as the queen of Egypt, his daughter would side with him. But the angel foretold that Cleopatra, she shall not stand, neither be for him. So rather than siding consistently with her father, she allied herself with her husband, the young king, against her father. And in this, she proved herself to be a very loyal and proper wife. She would neither be for him, that is, she would not act on behalf of her father, Antiochus III. The agreement certainly helped to ensure Egypt's neutrality in Syria's continuing struggle with Rome, but it did not garner the support that Antiochus had hoped for. When Ptolemy V died in 181, Cleopatra then became the true ruler of Egypt as regent for her young son, Ptolemy VI. And she ruled equitably, keeping peace with Syria while doing nothing to alienate Rome. And in this way, she kept Egypt free of invasion. Hence, Antiochus' scheme came to nothing. Remember, just as the political marriage of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus' daughter, became a failed attempt to control Syria, Berenice, so by the same token, Antiochus III's great similar action will also fail to give him control of Egypt. Of course, each of them failed in different ways. But their schemes failed nonetheless. In the case of Berenice, she was killed, but Cleopatra actually sided with her Egyptian husband. In verse 18, the angel foretold Antiochus' campaign against Rome. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles and shall take many. But a prince shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Yes, moreover, he shall cause his reproach to turn upon him. The phrase after this, it refers to the marriage Antiochus III had arranged between his daughter Cleopatra and the king of Egypt. He then resumed his campaigns into Asia Minor, joined by General Hannibal of Carthage. After Carthage had already fallen, Hannibal came and joined up with Antiochus. Antiochus is the third great. His aim was to break the power of Rome before it was too late, because he could see that Rome was now rising in power. And he shall take many. He was able to take Asia Minor under his control. He took Thrace and Greece. But a prince shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. So the prince here referred to here was the Roman consul named Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiaticus. That's a nice long name. He was the brother of Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal and destroyed Carthage. It is this prince, this Roman prince, who will cause the reproach to cease. Because in 191 BC, Lucius was able to defeat Antiochus III the Great at a place called Thermopylae, north of Athens, which had been Antiochus's base since 196 BC. So after 5 years of being there, he was driven from it. And in the year 190 BC, this Roman consul defeated him again at Magnesia on the Meander River in Lydia of Asia Minor, which was southwest of Ephesus. The overwhelming Roman triumph resulted in the peace of Apamea and brought an end to Seleucid rule in Asia Minor, because now Rome is rising up. He shall cause his reproach to turn upon him. What Antiochus III had planned for the Romans in Greece was forced upon himself. His scornful treatment of the Roman ambassadors in a meeting with them at Lysimachia, when he told them that Asia was not their concern and he was not subject to their orders, now blew up in his face. And the Romans began to move into Asia. In 188 BC, Antiochus was finally forced to accept the peace of Apamea and had to abandon all his territory in Asia Minor to Rome. Verse 19 now predicts the death of Antiochus III the Great. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. Historically, this prophecy was fulfilled when Antiochus returned home in defeat as a mere tributary to Rome. The peace negotiations forced him to pay a 15,000 talent indemnity over a 12-year period, surrender his elephants and fleet, and provide hostages, including his son Antiochus IV. His kingdom consisted now only of Syria, Mesopotamia, and Western Persia. In 187-186 BC, Antiochus was assassinated in a temple near Susa, which he tried to plunder to generate desperately needed income to pay his tribute to Rome. He used to plunder temples. Verse 20, we come to Seleucus IV Philopator. This is the next prophecy regarding the Seleucid Empire. Then shall stand up in his place one that shall cause an exactor to pass through the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. So this Syrian king will stand up in his place, that is, instead of Antiochus III the Great, when he died in 186 BC, His second son, Seleucus IV, for the Patriarch, got to stand up in his place. He took over. So this new king is Seleucus IV. He will cause an exactor to pass through to the glory of the kingdom. The exactor was known in history as Heliodorus. Now, while the previous king, while his dad, Antiochus III the Great, exempted many in Israel from taxation, and especially the temple, Seleucus IV didn't. He was forced to continue paying tribute to Rome, and he also plundered temples for it. He sent in Heliodorus to the glory of the kingdom. The kingdom is Israel, and the glory of Israel was the temple. He had to pay heavy tribute to Rome because of his father's defeat by the Romans. So because he had to raise 1,000 talents a year to Rome, Seleucus IV collected taxes from all his dominions. But this was especially heavy against the Jews. When he sent Heliodorus to Jerusalem, he didn't only expect him to pass on the new tax laws, but also to seize the temple treasury. Within a few days, it says he shall be destroyed. The expression "a few days" compares Seleucus IV's reign with that of his father, Antiochus III the Great, who had ruled for 37 years. But his son, Seleucus IV, ruled for only about 11 or 12 years, so it's roughly a third. Neither in anger nor in battle. In other words, he didn't die in a fit of anger, neither was he killed fighting. Now, some historical sources indicate he was poisoned by his faithful exactor, Heliodorus. Now, regardless of whether this is true or not, Heliodorus now declared himself regent upon the king's death and seized control of the government, but his reign was also short-lived. And that's where we're going to leave it for this session. Study hard, grow strong. This will be placed up onto our Arrow Ministries Australia YouTube channel within the next 36 hours or so. Thank you for coming along.